Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a Learning and Growing webinar on academic procrastination among college students, causes, consequences, and solutions. Our presenter today is Jared Brown of Concordia University, St. Paul, Minnesota. We are happy to have him back for another Learning and Growing webinar. My name is Sidra, and I'll be your moderator today for Hawks Learning. We do ask if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat throughout so that we can make sure that we get your questions answered as soon as the topic comes up. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Great. Well, thank you so much and welcome everyone. Hope all of you are doing well. And we're going to take a deep dive into the topic of academic procrastination today. This is a really fascinating, complex topic that we probably all deal with on some level at some point in our lives. If you have any questions about any of the content that I'll be covering today, again, type it in the chat box, the Q&A. I'll save some time throughout, and then I'll save a few minutes at the end as well. But if you think of questions after today's training, reach out anytime. I always get back to folks right away. If you've never heard me present before, I am a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant. I do a lot of work in a number of different areas related to psychology, forensics, mental health. But one of the topics I've been taking a deeper dive into is the topic of procrastination. And the reason why that I started learning more about that topic is because I frequently give presentations on topics related to executive function, self-regulation, and metacognition. And in those bases of research literature, the topic of procrastination does come up from time to time. So we'll talk about why those topics are very important to consider when we're examining this topic today. I believe all of you have a copy of today's training description along with the training objectives. So as we get into this topic, it is complex. There's a lot of moving parts going on. We just can't say there's one reason why someone procrastinates. Usually it's a multitude of factors that oftentimes converge and come together at the same time that can contribute to someone procrastinating. Some research says that procrastination is a behavioral trait. Some say it's an attitude or a disposition, and other studies talk about it as being a tendency. Depending on what camp you fall in, the research is pretty clear on this. Procrastination is a type of self-regulation deficit. We're going to talk about that a few times today. When we think about the causes and the consequences associated with procrastination, we need to be aware that in some cases, a person may procrastinate as a result of high levels of fear. Maybe they have the fear of failure, so they just give up and they don't even try. That's talked about. In some cases, it could be the result of perfectionistic attitudes. Other cases, maybe the person has an actual fear of success, so they're engaging in self-sabotaging behaviors. We'll talk about social anxiety today, mental health a little bit. Those are factors we want to take into account as well. High levels of stress can contribute to this. That can be a potential cause, but it can also be a potential consequence. We're going to talk a little bit about self-efficacy and self-esteem today and how those factor in to the equation. For some people, they may procrastinate due to memory issues or forgetfulness, where their intent maybe isn't to procrastinate, but they just simply forget because of some memory-based impairments. In other cases, it could be the result of sleep-related problems. There is definitely research literature that talks about chronic sleep deprivation and daytime fatigue as being potential consequences and causes for this. In other situations as well, the individual may be dealing with some level of disorganized thinking where it is very difficult for that student to keep things organized. And in their mind, it's very difficult to manage time, being planful, being mindful, and staying organized. So we're going to talk about all of these things today. If you look at this research literature, there's been numerous studies that have looked at the topic of procrastination within the context of a multitude of settings, including obviously college-based settings. Most of the research literature talks about academic procrastination as being intentional. I I don't think it's the case in every single circumstance that it's intentional, especially if the individual is chronically sleep deprived. Maybe they're dealing with some untreated mental health issues. Maybe they're dealing with some memory issues. So, in some instances, it could be unintentional. But most definitions of this talk about it as being intentional delay with starting a particular task, or maybe they're halfway through the task and they just end up not completing it. And in that situation and circumstance, it could be a motivational deficit. It could be the complexity of whatever they're working on just overwhelms the individual. And rather than asking for help or clarity, they just kind of throw in the towel. Be aware of the topic of grit. That can come up sometimes. If someone lacks grit and determination or perseverance, those are other variables that could potentially contribute to this in some circumstances. There's a lot packed into this slide here. What we're going to do, we're going to just pull out a few things. We're going to talk about executive function first. Executive function is one of the most important topics, in my opinion, that college professors absolutely need to be aware of, because executive function is at the heart of like learning, follow through, decision making, problem solving. It plays a critical role in that student's ability to really make sense of a lecture, being able to take a test or a quiz. And it plays a critical role in reading comprehension and writing as well. So, executive function is the boss of the brain. It's been referred to as the CEO of the brain. There's cognitive based components of executive function that relate to that student's planning abilities and their decision making abilities. There's self-regulation components of executive function where that relates to that student's level of motivation and that student's overall ability to manage their mood state, especially during times of stress. Another component of executive function that we're going to talk about a few times today is something called metacognition. Metacognition is basically thinking about thinking and knowing about your own knowing. It plays a very vital role in self-awareness. It plays a critical role in human beings understanding their strengths, their limitations, their ability to reflect on things that maybe they made mistakes on and make corrections in the future. And executive function plays a very critical role in social behavior. So if you're ever working with students that have a lot of social skill problems, they're highly disruptive in the classroom, they seem to rub other students the wrong way, those could be red flag indicators of potential executive functioning impairments. When we talk about self-regulation here, if a student is dealing with self-regulation problems, that could get in the way of that student's ability to manage change effectively. They could absolutely impact their ability to work in a group. So if you assign a group project to students and one of the students in there has profound self-regulation or executive function impairments, that can really get in the way of that student's ability to navigate that group setting. In some cases, students with high levels of self-regulation deficits may really have a difficult time staying on track, prioritizing things, and really staying focused without interrupting people consistently. So this particular slide here is a full day training. It's a lot packed into it, but that's a broad spectrum overview of executive function and self-regulation. We'll go a little bit deeper into that. If we believe what the research literature says, almost all university students procrastinate at some point. The research says between 90 and 95% of college students procrastinate anywhere between 30 to 60% of the time. Take into account that this statistic was before COVID-19. In my own observations, COVID-19, the related stressors, the worries, the fears have amplified this for some students. So we need to take into account maybe what kind of trauma the student's dealing with outside of school, sleep deprivation, the worry, the fear, the anxieties. These are all things that can amplify that student's level of procrastination. So academic procrastination, if you look at this research literature, is really broken up into 6 different areas. So we need to take into account it could involve any one of these or multiple or even all of these areas. So take this into account if you're noticing patterns with the students that who you're working with. A couple other consequences we want to just start considering. Depression can be amplified by procrastination, and depression can absolutely get in the way and drive up the bus with procrastination as well. For some students, it could be the direct result of performance anxiety, and it could be maybe a psychological adjustment problem as well. So we need to take into account, does that student really struggle with adjusting to like a new environment? We really need to take into account previous history as well if you're able to obtain that kind of information from your students. So there's a lot of different causes and contributing factors. We talked about some of these before, but we're going to go a lot deeper into that. So any one of these can absolutely exacerbate it and be a potential risk factor, warning sign, and consequence. If that student has had a long-standing history of having like lower academic performance, could academic procrastination be a factor that's never been addressed or identified? In some cases, absolutely. We need to be aware too that academic procrastination for some individuals can drive up their level of irritation. So if you notice students who procrastinate, but also deal with a high level of irritation, high levels of stress, worry, and fear, those are things that might show up from time to time. For some individuals who procrastinate, they may have a higher level of regret or self blame or even personal shame, which can trickle down and really impact that student's self esteem. If you look at the self esteem research literature, that has been linked to some students being more shy, more withdrawn, and even more quiet if they have very low levels of self esteem. For some students with low levels of self-esteem, this can get in the way of their ability to work in a group again. So we need to be aware of how that student functions in a group setting. For some people with low levels of self-esteem, it has also been linked with having more communication problems. So if you ever notice a student that might have like lower levels of self-esteem, maybe some depression, it might not be uncommon in some situations that student may struggle with communicating his or her thoughts to the class or to that college professor. So self-esteem is a big, big topic that you also want to take into account. To visually lay this out here, a lot of things to consider, but these are some other possible contributing factors. I have decision-making difficulties underlined here. That is a big, big topic. When a student has decision-making deficits, that it is a red flag indicator that that individual is dealing with some level of executive functioning impairments. But it's not as simple as that. We got to dig deeper. When you have a student that really struggles with decision-making problems, there's an increased likelihood that they may really struggle with planning, with initiating a task. You might have a student that struggles with task initiation. Basically, what that means is the student doesn't know when or where or how maybe to begin a certain task. It can be very overwhelming in some cases. For some individuals who have decision-making problems, they may really struggle with problem solving deficits as well as conflict resolution skills as well. And in some situations, when you are working with a student who has decision-making issues, They may also be dealing with attention problems, where if you've ever noticed maybe a student has a very difficult time staying focused, they seem to be drifting off a lot. It's hard to capture that student's attention. Their mind is constantly wandering. That's another variable that we need to take into account. Again, I know I'm covering a lot of information today in a short amount of time, so feel free to type in any thoughts, questions, or concerns into the Q&A box. Other associated factors we need to take into account is impulsivity. If you're not familiar with the impulsivity literature, basically this would be a student that might have a tendency to present as more urgent. They have a very difficult time kind of pausing, reflecting. In some cases, high levels of impulse control issues can look like that student is very impatient. It could present on the surface that that student really has a hard time taking into account other people's perspectives, feelings, and even their time. In some cases, students with impulse control problems may try to monopolize the conversation. Most of the time, they're not doing it intentionally. That is another executive functioning impairment. High levels of impulsivity are related to people that struggle with planning for the future as well. So, for some students who have these issues of impulse control issues, they may really struggle with thinking about the future and planning ahead. That can really get in the way of that student's success overall. Other things we want to take into account: goal-directed behaviors, goal-directed activities. It is a very important topic for us to be aware of, because at the core of goal-directed behaviors are those executive functions that we talked about earlier. Later on this year, I will be doing a training just on executive function for Hawkes Learning, so be on the lookout for that if you do want to learn more about the topic. But if you ever have a student that really struggles with achieving their goals, that is an executive function impairment. If you have a student who struggles with managing time, they just always show up late to class, they just can't seem to stay organized, those are all rooted in executive function impairments. And the research literature is very clear on this. People that have executive function impairments may be dealing with higher levels of stress, frustration, fear. Executive function impairments have been linked with having more daytime exhaustion and fatigue, which can absolutely get in the way of that student's ability to perform academically. Executive function impairments have been linked with higher levels of shame, more conflict, more self-defeating behaviors, and more behavioral problems, just to name a few. So this is a really big topic that you absolutely want to be aware of. So earlier I mentioned the metacognition briefly, but let's go a little bit deeper into this. Let's just focus first on self-regulation. So when we think of self-regulation, it's really our ability to kind of put on the brakes, pause, reflect, our ability to delay gratification. There's really three big components of self-regulation. We have the cognitive domain of self-regulation. This relates to our problem-solving abilities, decision-making, goal planning. There's also emotional self-regulation. So if you've ever been around someone that has extreme up and down mood swings, they just have a very difficult time regulating strong emotions, that's an emotional self-regulation deficit. And then there's something called behavioral self-regulation that can really get in the way of someone's ability to follow rules. That has also been linked with having more impulse control problems. People with more behavioral self-regulation deficits may lack persistence. So when things get tough, they just kind of throw in the towel. They lack that grit. So the list goes on. So a lot of things to consider when we're thinking about self-regulation. With metacognition, again, this is thinking about thinking, knowing about knowing. It is a higher order cognitive process that human beings possess. When people have deficits in the area of metacognition, it can really get in their way of learning and thinking and reflecting and picking up and detecting when errors are being made. People with metacognition deficits oftentimes have a difficult time connecting the dots, planning for the future, understanding cause and effect relationships, and they may have a really difficult time seeing the big picture in things. They sometimes can have laser pinpoint focus where they have a hard time seeing the forest through the trees, basically. So that's metacognition kind of in a nutshell. This is another component you'd really want to be aware of when we're studying this through the lens of executive function. This is psychological inflexibility. Basically, how this would look in a potential student is they have more rigid thinking. They can almost present as if they're very stubborn. So think about inflexible thinking. They have a hard time shifting between two topics. They have a hard time being adaptable. And it can really look like their way or the highway. That's basically psychological inflexibility in a nutshell. And this is another component that falls under the umbrella of executive function. I'm just going to stop there for just a second and see if we have any questions or thoughts on any of that information we covered in kind of the first third of today's training.
We do. How is executive functioning impairment linked to ADHD?
Well, there's an argument to be made that ADHD is kind of an executive function based disorder. We know that in the DSM-5 Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, ADHD is classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder, but everybody with ADHD will be dealing with some level of those executive function impairments. ADHD is a complicated topic. There are different subtypes. You have inattentive ADHD, you have the impulsivity side, and you can have a combined type. The causes for ADHD are unknown, but usually when students have ADHD, and if it's undiagnosed, they're going to have a hard time paying attention. They may have a hard time sitting still. Most people with ADHD have sleep problems as well. So that's just a little bit on ADHD. If you want me to go deeper in the weeds on that, definitely I can do that. I do a lot of work in that area as well. So great question. And just know with ADHD, there's so many disorders out there that look like ADHD, and in some cases it may not be. Digestive health issues can look like ADHD the way it presents. Chronic sleep deprivation can cause ADHD-like symptoms. Untreated sleep apnea, pain disorders, the list goes on. So just be aware that ADHD symptoms can present like a whole host of things as well. So any other questions I can answer before we move on to the next section?
That's it for now.
All right. Rumination has been linked to an increase in procrastination. So if a student ruminates, this is basically a problematic thinking pattern where somebody focuses on the negative. They have a really hard time getting a particular thought or idea out of their head. There is something called depressive rumination, where someone ruminates on depressive thoughts. In some cases, some people may have anger rumination, where it contributes to an amplification of anger control issues. How do we address rumination? Teaching limit setting skills, journaling has been helpful, utilizing solution focused approaches, helping that student identify potential triggers. Meditation has been helpful, exercise, sleep improvement strategies. So just be aware of these things. Maybe if a student has extreme difficulty in the area of rumination, they might do well working with like a school counselor to work on some different strategies to help address that. Personality features have been discussed in this literature as well. Some literature points to the fact that people with higher like neurotic tendencies may be more likely to procrastinate. By no means am I saying if someone procrastinates, they fall under the umbrella of neuroticism, but people who have neuroticism may be more likely to procrastinate. People with neuroticism are more likely to ruminate. They're more likely to focus on negative thoughts. They're more likely to have sleep problems, the research literature says as well. And they're more likely to have anger, anxiety, jealousy, and loneliness, just to name a few. This external locus of control, if you're not familiar with this, basically, I would really say this is more of a problematic pattern of behavior. So external locus of control really relates to someone always seeming to have something outside of them happen to create internal happiness. Only if I got an A, only if that person said hi to me, I can have a good day. That's external locus of control. Internal locus of control is really a better strategy to use. When we have internal locus of control, we typically have higher levels of self-efficacy. We typically have higher levels of motivation, self-esteem. We can engage in reflective thinking, and we typically have better stress management strategies as well. Sleep problems are absolutely linked to poor academic functioning, including academic procrastination. So in some cases, if that student has a tendency to procrastinate, the very nature of the worry and stress of all of those tasks that may be building up on that student can impact their sleep health. So then the next day, they wake up, maybe they only got a few hours of sleep, they're sleep deprived, they come to class, their memory's not working properly, they're having a really hard time staying focused. Sleep is a big topic, and the research literature points to the fact that an elevated percentage of college students do deal with sleep deprivation for a variety of reasons. It could be self-imposed, it could be because of stress and anxiety, it could be from chronic consumption of alcohol, sugar sweetened beverages, energy drinks. There's people that work night shift jobs. The reasons for this are many and varied, but just know that chronic sleep deprivation and poor academic performance and procrastination oftentimes go hand in hand. What happens if the student has some sort of mobile phone addiction, screen time addiction? This is talked about in this literature as well. People that have a true addiction to the internet, the screen, the cell phone, it has been linked with increases in depression, anxiety, sleep issues, procrastination. This is a real thing. I do a lot of work in the area of screen time addiction. I've consulted on multiple cases the last several years. This is a real thing. This is a threat to someone's health and wellness. Just really be aware of that. Social anxiety is another factor that we need to take into account in some circumstances. If that student is dealing with high levels of social anxiety, that could be a potential driver for procrastination. When we think of social anxiety, this is basically more intense anxiety. It's a persistent fear of being judged, being watched by others. So someone that has true social anxiety may really struggle being in a classroom setting in some cases, working in a group. People with true social anxiety likely will really struggle with giving presentations in front of other people. For some individuals with high levels of social anxiety, there is research to point to the fact in some cases that could be linked with earlier forms of childhood trauma, earlier forms of abuse, neglect. In some cases, it could be earlier histories of being bullied and teased and humiliated. I encourage college professors to just be mindful of this, because if a student truly is dealing with social anxiety, the very nature of having to give a presentation in front of the class could be very trauma triggering. I don't know what the true answer is if it's part of your curriculum, but just take that into account. It can be very challenging for some students, and it could relate to that student truly procrastinating or maybe not even showing up to class that day. Sluggish cognitive tempo is a really fascinating topic. These are symptoms that resemble signs of inattentive ADHD. If a student has true sluggish cognitive tempo, it's going to look like excessive daydreaming in the class. That student is likely going to have a difficult time sustaining attention and initiating a certain task. Students with sluggish cognitive tempo oftentimes speak slower, process information in a much slower manner, and they can behave very lethargically. So they maybe move a little more slower. They have a really hard time staying alert in boring situations. And sluggish cognitive tempo has been linked with a number of problematic outcomes for academic performance, problems with interacting with other classmates effectively. Sluggish cognitive tempo has also been linked with having more emotional and behavioral problems. This is a really fascinating topic, and in my experience, most professionals have never even heard of this topic, but it is something that does come up from time to time. A little bit more about executive function. These are some other examples that you would want to be aware of when studying the topic of executive function. Let's just pick out self-management, for example. This is a very important area to target for intervention, especially if you want to help students improve follow through and reduce academic procrastination. If you are working with students on helping them improve their self-management skills, you're really focusing on helping that student learn how to plan more effectively, learn how to stay more organized. So maybe you're teaching them how to use a calendar or some sort of digital organizer, just helping them get more organized in their day-to-day life. Working on accountability is a big topic that falls under the umbrella of self-management as well. Teaching students how to have persistence, even though maybe they have the feeling of throwing in the towel and giving up, teaching them to push through that, not to give in to that feeling. Also, it talks a lot about self-monitoring as well. So teaching students how to self-monitor, how to be more mindful when they need a break, when they need to ask a question, when they need to ask for help, when they maybe need to take a nap or try to get some better sleep. Those are all things that you'd want to consider under this umbrella of self-management. I give lots and lots of talks on the topic of alexithymia to different groups. This is a fascinating topic that comes up a lot in the mental health world, the criminal justice field, but it is a topic that's also talked about within the context of learning and academic performance. If a student has true alexithymia, this is going to be a student that has a very difficult time making sense of emotions, processing emotions, labeling emotions, naming emotions. This has been linked with having more problems in the area of learning. It's been linked with procrastination. It's been linked with sleep issues, more depression. If you go online and Google my name and type in alexithymia, you can find several podcasts and articles I've written on this topic. There is a very high likelihood, if you're working with students who are under a great deal of stress and dealing with student burnout, they're probably dealing with some level of alexithymia. College professors need to be aware of this as well. If you're dealing with burnout yourself, burnout is very common among people with alexithymia. So this is definitely something we need to be aware of. If we have any individuals in the crowd who are like leaders of your college or organization, this is a really important topic to be aware of and implement into like a burnout prevention program as well. Phubbing is a fascinating topic. This basically is a student possibly sitting in your classroom on their phone. You're giving a lecture, and that student is constantly on their gadget or texting and not paying attention to you. They're paying attention to their phone. Maybe they're working in a group with other students, and that student is not paying attention to any of the other students in the group, and they're really just focused on their phone or the internet. That's phubbing in a nutshell. You ever go out to coffee or like dinner with people and you see that nobody's talking to each other, or someone's always on their phone and someone's trying to talk to them and that person's never making eye contact? That's called phubbing. Phubbing has actually been linked with more relationship problems, more conflict, and just overall less satisfaction in life. I'll stop just for a second before we move into the next section to see if we have any thoughts or questions that I can clarify on that previous section.
Nothing yet.
No worries. In the research literature, by no means is this an all-encompassing list, but these are some of the screening tools and assessment tools that are used in some of the academic procrastination studies. If you are a counselor, school counselor, if you're working in an academic environment and you really want to support students in this area, learning about these screening tools would be quite helpful, and maybe implementing them into the work you do if you have the appropriate qualifications, credentials, and it's within the context of whatever you're doing within that school environment. Without a doubt, again, procrastination can impact overall health and well-being, emotional well-being, psychological well-being, social well-being, and physical well-being, to name a few. When we think of, just let's say the student is dealing with poor mental well-being, and maybe procrastination is one factor of many that's contributing to that, it's likely that these factors are having a negative impact on that student's overall thoughts, thinking patterns, and feelings. In some cases, it could negatively impact that student's overall ability to cope with stress, to cope with change, to cope with the different demands that are often required to navigate successfully through college. Poor mental well-being, without a doubt, has been linked again with more sleep problems. It can exacerbate physical health issues such as more stomach problems, chest pain, headaches, daytime fatigue, and it can absolutely trickle down into negatively impacting that student's motivation and get in the way of them actually achieving their academic goals. If you look at the wellness literature, there's a whole host of articles that talk about the wellness literature, well-being literature. Anything we can do to support student health and wellness is obviously imperative. They're going to be in a much better position to achieve their goals. I'm a big fan of holistic interventions, utilizing empowering approaches, really focusing on self-care strategies. These are different things just to consider maybe implementing within your college program if appropriate. Unfortunately, too, and this is pretty common sense, but just know that high levels of procrastination, high levels of stress, high levels of worry can absolutely contribute to that student withdrawing from a class or completely withdrawing from college. So this has significant implications for helping students not really throw in the towel and give up on college. Many stressors have been identified in the college literature. We know that when students go to college, they typically have increased responsibilities. Maybe they're trying to navigate a work life with a school life. They're trying to balance everything out. Maybe some people, again, maybe lack time management. They might benefit from learning some time management skills. For some students, looking at their eating patterns or eating practices, unfortunately, are quite common among especially undergraduate students, the research says. For some students, maybe they're dealing with some outside stressors, worries, fears, traumas. Maybe there's some family conflict going on. So we need to take into account not only the stress that might be going on within the college environment, but what might be going on outside of that environment can have an impact on this as well. Looking at the external consequences of this, again, there's a lot of things to take into account. It can get in the way of student performance, or in some cases, contribute to inconsistent performance. Maybe they have a real desire to learn, but procrastination gets in the way of that student really retaining that information because their mind is racing and they're constantly worried about trying to get caught up. These things can trickle down into more health problems, emotional and behavioral and physical, just to name a few. We also need to be aware, again, these things here, in combination with many of those other things I spoke about, can contribute to increases in conflict in some cases with fellow students. In other situations, it could contribute to increases in conflict with school professionals as well. So if you ever notice a student seems to have a lot of conflict, dig deeper, take a step back, stay curious. Could there be something going on around the area of procrastination that could be amplifying their stress, their worries, their fears, their anxieties around this topic? All right, so back to self-regulation again, just a little bit. So again, if someone procrastinates, that is a self-regulation deficit. That is very clear from the research literature. I have inhibition underlined here. Inhibition is another component that falls under the umbrella of executive function. Think of inhibition as our internal parking brake, our pause button. It's really our ability as human beings to stop, to reflect, to think through things, to manage our emotions. If you or someone you know or a student you work with has lower levels of inhibition, this has been linked to more issues with procrastination. In some cases, people with low levels of inhibition might have an unusual relationship with food. They might have a tendency to overeat, abuse caffeine, abuse sugar. People with low levels of inhibition may be more likely to use higher levels of alcohol, have more shopping problems in some cases. It can impact driving behaviors. This is a big factor for road rage or just aggressive driving behaviors. People with lower levels of inhibition might be more likely in some cases to have more addictive tendencies to like internet gaming, social media sites. So basically, disinhibition relates to that inability to kind of put on the brakes and pause and reflect and think through one's actions before thinking. Some other things you just want to be on the lookout for, just visually again, pointing this out when we look at this through a self-regulation deficit lens. If you have students that have a high level of disorganization, disorganized thinking, they always show up to class late, they just don't seem to have any of their materials together, they have a very hard time taking notes while listening to you simultaneously, that could be a self-regulation deficit. Students that have poor impulse control, again, they have a really hard time not sitting patiently. They blurt out answers. They're just very disruptive. They're constantly moving around the classroom and fidgeting. And even in some cases, just being very disrespectful and not following rules. That could be a potential self-regulation deficit. The question we had earlier about ADHD, in some cases, high levels of self-regulation can oftentimes mimic ADHD-like symptoms, or it is oftentimes a component of ADHD. And this poor task persistence, again, this is students that might really struggle with knowing when to start a task, when to end a task. They get lost halfway through. They might need a little more coaching, modeling, teaching, a little more encouragement. And the time management, poor time management could be another factor to take into account. And when we're talking about self-regulation, I use it interchangeably with low self-control, but I just wanted to point this out here if anyone's interested in this. It's not necessarily 100% related to what we're talking about, but low self-control has been linked with more criminal behavior, more drug problems, more addictive tendencies in these areas, and more binge eating problems. And in some cases, students with low self-control might be more likely to bully other students in some instances as well. College students who are dealing with some of these things we're talking about today may be more likely to have higher levels of internalizing problems. These are related to more depression, more anxiety, more loneliness, as well as externalizing problems. These are more behavioral problems, rule following problems, impulse control issues, in some cases, more disobedient behavior, kind of on that extreme end. Just know when you're working with students who are dealing with tons and tons of stress and worry and even trauma in some cases, be aware of those internalizing symptoms as well as externalizing symptoms. So to recap, I think we've covered all of these, but I just want to visually remind us again why we're here today. This is an important topic. If these things aren't identified and addressed, it can contribute to that student withdrawing from class or college more. It can amplify depression, anxiety, worry, and all of these other things. So again, I commend all of you for taking time out of your day to listen to this. Before we move into tips, strategies, solutions, some of the positive aspects of this, any thoughts, questions on that last section that I can answer for any of you?
Nothing in the Q&A or chat so far.
So as we move into the more positives of this,
Oh, nope, we have one.
yeah, go ahead.
How can you correct this type of behavior in college? Which I think you're going to go through right now.
That's this next section. If I don't answer that question, please call me out and tell me to do this training over again. So we'll talk about a number of different strategies depending on the student. They may be dealing with a lot of mental health challenges. So they might benefit from talking to a school counselor, getting a referral to like a therapist, psychologist. So we need to be aware of that. For some students, they may just need to work with their instructor, maybe some one-on-one coaching, really identify potential barriers. So each student is different. Each student has unique strengths, and some students have more barriers than others as well. So we need to take all of those things into account and really individualize our approach. If we have any counselors listening today who work in a college setting, you might do well utilizing solution-focused brief counseling. And this has been studied within the context of academic procrastination. This is just a brief overview of what that is. If you're a counselor, you're looking for some more therapeutic interventions, reach out to me anytime. I have a million things I can share with you. Skills building for some students, this can be very, very helpful. Coaching, modeling, teaching, role playing. Maybe you're focusing on enhancing self-reflective skills or self-awareness. Those are components of that metacognition we spoke about before. Really being aware of that component of self-control, self-regulation, and inhibition, or that inability to delay gratification. These are very, very important target areas to help students improve getting their tasks done. And if the students learn how to do these things more effectively, it's not just going to help them procrastinate less, it's probably going to help them in a number of other areas of their life as well. So executive function, we need to be aware that this is, again, a very important area to target, because if you're working with students who procrastinate consistently, it really is an executive function based impairment. Executive function interventions are focused on targeting a specific skill. So if you know that that student struggles with time management, maybe struggles with disorganization, you target the specific area that they're struggling with. You want to try to identify realistic goals. You want to take into account that student's learning style, their overall motivation. You want to help them establish and prioritize appropriate time around this, helping them chunk out time. Time can be a very, really confusing topic for some people. I'll talk about that in just a minute. For some students, they may be visual learners. For other students, they may be more auditory. For other students, they may be dealing with a combination, but you want to really understand their learning style. If you can do that, that can be very, very helpful as well. So metacognition, again, thinking about thinking, knowing about knowing, helping that student become more aware of their barriers and limitations, but also capitalizing on their strengths, their attributes, and doing a lot of encouragement and a lot of motivation. Part of metacognition training, again, is really teaching planning skills, some of those self-management or self-monitoring skills we spoke about before. If you go online and just type in metacognition training, you'll find a lot of great resources online. Teaching the student how to self-monitor, again, being aware of their own thoughts and feelings, their body movement, being aware that maybe they're tired, they need to take a break. A lot of this has to do with more self-awareness. If you can teach a student to have better self-monitoring strategies, this has been linked with promoting improved social skills. It's been linked with having improved goal setting and goal planning abilities. And it's also been linked with having greater levels of self-evaluation skills. So students are more likely then to self-evaluate and really look back on what I did well with, what do I need to work harder with, when do I need to ask for more help. All of these things can be very helpful in helping that student be very successful. Promoting self-efficacy is also highly recommended. Higher levels of self-efficacy have been linked with increases in self-esteem, increases in more positive thinking, so having a more positive mindset. And it's also been linked with achieving one's goals much more effectively. We also need to be aware of, again, for some students, they may be dealing with a high level of stress or some mental health problems. These are potential interventions that show up in this literature. For some counselors, people that have appropriate training in these areas, mindfulness-based strategies have been shown to be helpful. If you're not familiar with mindfulness-based approaches, these are basically interventions that can help people develop an attitude of more non-judgment and helping people become more curious and more open and more accepting. It's also been linked with having greater levels of self-control and greater levels of self-awareness as well. Deep breathing exercises, gentle yoga exercises all fall under the umbrella of mindfulness. Executive function skills we talked about, helping students learn how to manage emotions more effectively, and developing some of those problem solving skills we spoke about before as well. We spoke briefly about grit early on, but if you're not familiar with the grit literature, basically this relates to perseverance, someone's effort to hang in there when things get tough. An example would be maybe a student's taking a very difficult class and they just have the thoughts of dropping out and giving up, but they push through it. That's a form of grit. It's been linked to having more courage, greater levels of resilience, and greater levels of self-control, just to name a few. How do you build grit? This can be for us, can be for anyone. Having a strengths-based mindset has been linked to promoting more grit. If you use a strengths-based mindset, you're aware of the limitations and barriers, but you capitalize on the positives. You capitalize on hopeful thinking. You focus on having a growth mindset. Promoting grit requires practice, it requires patience, and it also requires having good self-care as well. Teaching time management skills can be very, very helpful. People that have poor time management skills, obviously, that's been linked to all kinds of things: stress, anxiety, worry. People that don't use time effectively just sometimes go through their day and look back, what did I truly get done? People with poor time management can come off as more disorganized. They may struggle with more multitasking. And in some cases, they can present as being very indecisive as well. So those are some red flag indicators that you'd want to be aware of. Time's a fascinating topic. I actually gave a talk last year just on time management difficulties to a different group, and it's really much more complex than we realize. How do people use time? Do they understand the concept of time? Do they understand what a minute feels like, or an hour, or a day? What is that person's overall attitude about time like? Do they prioritize time? Planning abilities have a lot to do with this. Do they value other people's time as well? So being aware of time management, huge, huge topic. In the academic procrastination literature as well, it also talks about in some cases, it might be helpful for that student to be in some sort of support group or education group where maybe everyone in there struggles with procrastination and they can encourage and motivate and learn from each other. Some of the research points to the fact that that can be very helpful. The very nature of exercising, not living a sedentary lifestyle, just getting movement has been linked with reducing procrastination. So, exercise, wonderful. Exercise is medicine, no doubt in my mind. Exercise has also been linked with lower levels of stress and anxiety. If you exercise regularly, it's been linked with having greater levels of self esteem. It's been also linked with promoting emotional intelligence. Really fascinating literature there. Unfortunately, we know from the research literature that some college students do not live a healthy lifestyle. They may not eat good food. If some of you were part of that training I did a few months ago for Hawks Learning on sugar sweetened beverage consumption among college students, we talked about this. You can find that online. I encourage you to check it out if you're really interested in learning about kind of unhealthy lifestyle practices that might be more common among college students. Self-compassion interventions have been shown to be very helpful as well. Chronic procrastination can lower self-compassion. If we have lower levels of self-compassion, we're more self-critical. We might carry around more guilt or shame. It can erode our self-esteem. Having higher levels of self-compassion have been linked to so many positive outcomes. Self-compassion literature is just fascinating. It's wonderful. If you can implement this into any field of study, any organization, it's been linked with all kinds of positive benefits. These are just some of the benefits associated with practicing self-compassion on a regular basis. And just to visually point this out here, again, when we're thinking about academic procrastination, there are a host of reasons for this. Every student presents differently. The reasons for this are many and varied. It's likely a combination between internal and external factors. These are just a few of the internal factors that you'd want to take into account, as well as the external factors. If you want a copy of my PowerPoint slides, just shoot me an email. I'll share these slides with any one of you. And before we wrap up, just a few more tips, strategies, and solutions to consider. Cognitive use strategies may be helpful, just helping people think more about their thinking, helping them increase their ability to problem solve, helping them develop more motivational skills, teaching them goal-directed behaviors can be very helpful. Psychoeducation is basically teaching people about a particular topic. So if you have students that struggle with procrastination, the research literature points to the fact the very nature of just educating them about procrastination may actually lower their procrastination. Promote positive protective factors, getting good sleep, exercise, nutrition, journaling, reflective journaling, gratitude journaling can be very helpful. Be aware of those executive function kind of interventions we spoke about today. And anything we can do to promote positive brain health, body health have all been linked with lower levels of procrastination. I appreciate all of you taking time out of your day today. I'll stick around as long as we need to answer any questions that you may have.
Um, so there's a question, it's kind of a curveball.
I
Do you
love it. Come
know
on.
what the name of a trait is for someone who's the opposite of a procrastinator? Their TAs and that person tend to be the opposite of procrastinators. They tend to be more motivated to get the worst over with sooner, rather than having it hang over them. They're interested in doing some research, but they can't think of the name of it. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I mean, it could be on the spectrum of being a perfectionist, but I mean, if someone wants to get the worst over first, I focus like that. I like to get the worst over first because then it's not looming over me. And if you can do that, it's you're getting rid of the hardest task first, then you're opening up more brain space to focus on all these other tasks. I mean, just being proactive, I think that to me that's a good approach. In terms of the actual name for that, I'm not sure if there is a name. Maybe there is. If anyone knows an exact name for that, please type it in the chat box.
Yep. And then if you wouldn't mind sharing the slide that has your email address on there, and then anybody that wants a copy of your slides, please email Jared, and then he will send you his slides. We have two other questions. How has COVID and all the stress and trauma from it factor into this equation of procrastination?
Yeah, you bet. Great question. I typed in my email in the chat box, so if you have that, just think of COVID-19 as a stressor, a trauma, an accelerant. So if the student was dealing with procrastination before COVID, there's probably an increased likelihood that it probably is exacerbating their procrastination in some cases during the era of COVID and beyond. The reason why that is because obviously COVID-19 was stressful, lots of worry, lots of fear. All of those factors can deplete that person's energy. It's been linked with having more sleep problems, more depression. For some students, if they had COVID, they could possibly be dealing with long haul COVID symptoms as well, which have been linked with having more brain fog. And if you're dealing with brain fog, that can absolutely get in the way of accomplishing your task in a timely manner. So just consider all of this within the era of COVID-19 and beyond, and really think of COVID-19 as almost an amplifier for some of these already pre-existing issues.
Okay, great, thank you. And then how does procrastination affect the college professor, not just the students?
Yeah, I mean, we're all human. We all procrastinate regardless of what field of study we're in. So everything I spoke about today can apply to the professional as well. So I think as college professors, we need to be self-aware of these things. We need to be aware of the topics of burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, empathy fatigue. If we have any leaders here today, again, implementing some of these strategies and supports and services into like an in-service day or into your leadership practices. I have a postdoctoral certificate in leadership and organizational management, and part of that program I studied health promoting leadership practices, resilience-based approaches, and even neuromanagement. Really taking all of those things into account can really help support the health and wellness of your organization as well as your employees, which basically, if we have a healthier workforce, we're in a much better position to support the students that we serve as well. It's a win-win, I think.
Absolutely. I think we have one more question.
Yeah, you bet.
No, it was just someone saying it was a great presentation. Well, I think that's all the time we have today for questions. Thank you, Jared, and thank you all for attending today. We will be emailing you a link to view the recording of this webinar once it's available. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat now for easy access. These free webinars are brought to you by Hawks Learning, an innovative educational courseware company. To learn more about our mastery-based course materials and how Hawks can enhance learning outcomes for you and your students, please visit hawkslearning.com, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.